I want to introduce you this morning to a member of our family. He's not really, he's kind of my dog by default, but not really my dog. This is Carson. Carson is my son's dog, but he now dwells with me, and wow, I can't believe I messed it up. She now dwells in our residence, and there's some things about Carson that are pretty, well, not unique, but just here it is, right? The first thing that if you want to know Carson, that you need to know about her is she is single-minded. She has one thing on her mind, and there are really only two things, but it's always just one. The first one is food. That's her first greatest love is food. But it only takes her about 2 minutes to eat her 2 meals every day. So that's 1 minute each meal. So that leaves 23 hours and 58 minutes for her other favorite pastime, which is toy. And every waking moment, she is either eating or she wants to be playing with her toy. She's single-minded. The second thing about Carson is she is loyal to her people. And her people are the people who feed her and the people who throw her toy. And the more you throw her toy, the more people, your people, her people you are, right? So she is single-minded, she is loyal, and she is protective of the people who feed her and throw her toy. Fiercely protective. And it's in her DNA, if you know anything, she's mostly German Shepherd, if not all German Shepherd. We don't really know for sure. Mostly German Shepherd. And that's not atypical for German Shepherds. They tend to be very single-minded, very focused. They tend to be very loyal and protective of their people. Not unusual. And she's had some experiences that kind of feed those tendencies, those inclinations. The problem that Carson has is that in her fierce loyalty and protectiveness, she sometimes perceives threats where they do not exist. And she does not distinguish between real threats and perceived threats in the way that she responds, right? Any threat that she perceives is a real threat to her, and she reacts, shall we say, aggressively, assertively. And because of her responses to real and perceived threats, particularly her response to perceived threats, Carson, it costs her in some ways, right? Carson will never, ever have the opportunity to have a relationship with our mail carrier because she perceives our mail carrier as a threat, even though our mail carrier is not a threat. Actually, anyone who wears any kind of uniform to our doorstep, Carson perceives as a threat. So because of her misperception and response, she is deprived of certain relationships and certain opportunities in the world. I have some Carson-like qualities. Deb will tell you that I am single-minded. I will tell you that I'm single-minded. I am doing one thing, only ever one thing. And if you think I'm doing two things, I'm doing one or the other. I'm only doing one. I'm single-minded. I'm pretty loyal. Maybe sometimes to a fault, to my people. And I also have some natural inclinations and experiences that trigger certain responses. And some of them are real, and some of them are perceived. Things like, I remember in detail an experience that I had in second grade when I said something and the class laughed at me. And I never again have ever walked into a classroom and opened my mouth and made a statement without remembering that feeling, not always remembering the experience, but remembering that feeling of being in second grade and feeling ashamed because I said something that people laughed at. Or I remember vividly in junior high school walking into the cafeteria, and there were 6 seats at every table, and walking up to an empty seat and being told that chair was for somebody else, and after a few times very clearly discovered it really wasn't just for somebody else, it was just somebody besides me. And to this day, if I walk into a crowded room and there's a table and I've got to find some place to seat, I have that same feeling of anxiousness about that experience. Perceiving threats where they don't actually exist, and at a cost. Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good person brings good things out of the good stored up in their heart, and an evil person brings evil things out of the evil stored up in their heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." So I want to just make a couple notes about this passage. The first one is this. Jesus says in this passage that the heart has storage capacity. Right? Things get stored up inside of our hearts. And he says that what's stored up inside of our hearts, what's stored up in that storage capacity inside our hearts, he says, determines what happens on the outside of us. What's stored up inside produces what comes out. Now, he uses the words good and evil, and I want to press pause on the moral judgment for just a second, right? Because when we think of good and evil, we say, well, we don't think of it. It's like that's bad and that's good. And anything that's evil is bad and anything that's good is good. And so, but that moral judgment that comes with that, what Jesus is saying is that anything that helps us is good, and anything that hurts us is evil. Right? Because we were made for life, we were made for goodness, we were made for love, so anything that produces that in our lives, that's good stuff, and anything that denies that or that keeps us from that, whether we would say, hey, it's evil, it's bad. Jesus came to have life and have it to the full. Anything that's opposed to that life is, at its core, is evil. When the stuff that's inside of us is hurting us on the outside, we have words that we use to describe that. We often talk about emotional baggage. Anybody have any emotional baggage, right? Anything stored up inside that you find like coming outside in ways that you wish that it wouldn't? We have a much easier time seeing in other people. Like maybe you don't know what your emotional baggage is, but you sure do know what your spouse's emotional baggage is, right? The stuff that's stored up inside when it comes outside and it's hurting us is emotional baggage. And it can be fear, and it can be shame or anger or regret, or any number of other things. Emotions are reactions to or expressions of deeper things that are going on inside of our hearts. They're default responses that are actually produced by chemicals in our brain that are released in response to interpretation of a specific trigger. Something's happened, stored up inside of us, that triggers that response in our brain, that emotional response. It takes about a quarter of a second for our brain to identify the trigger. And another quarter of a second for the brain then to send chemicals to our brain and throughout our bodies in response to that trigger. It happens in an instant. Emotional responses inside of us. Triggers are reactions to past experiences. And a trigger can be something that we see. It can be something that we smell. Smell is a powerful memory activator. It can be something that we taste. It can be something that we feel. It can be any number of things that remind us of something that happens in the past that triggers this emotional response, and then it emits these chemicals throughout our brain. And then in the wake of that, our brain assigns feelings to that emotional response. We see something, we hear something, we smell something, it activates the emotional response, and then our brain says, I feel sad. We may not even know why we feel sad because we haven't identified yet where that emotion comes from. But I feel sad, or I feel angry, or I feel invisible, or I feel conspicuous. I feel like everybody's looking at me, or I feel like I'm 2 years old again, or I'm 13 years old again. I feel embarrassed. And a lot of our feelings that we have in response to these emotional triggers, a lot of our feelings, they don't actually feel good, right? Do you have feelings that you wish you didn't feel? That you wish would just go away? That you wish you would never feel again? And over time, like when we're young, our feelings are kind of close to the surface, right? It's easy to tell how a 2-year-old's feeling. They put it right out there for you to see and hear, know, and smell. But as we age, we become a little more sophisticated. And we increase in our capacity to shove those, we don't stop our emotional responses, but to shove those feelings down, or to find a way to distract us so we don't feel those things anymore, or to shut off a part of our life so that we don't experience those feelings anymore, or to anesthetize them. I don't like feeling this way, I take a drink. I don't like feeling this way, I take a hit. I don't like feeling this way, I turn on the TV. I don't like all different kinds of ways that we navigate and avoid and shut off these parts of our hearts that hurt us. Our unintended sorrows and heartaches are among the top soul killers in our lives. Shutting us down. Because see, when you shut off a part of your heart to pain, you also shut off that part of your heart to pleasure. When you shut off a part of your heart to sorrow, you shut off that same part of your heart to joy. Unexpressed grief keeps large parts of our hearts shut down and can lead us, specifically in our relationship with God, to turn away. To say, this thing that I feel is God's fault. Why didn't He stop it? Why doesn't He make it go away? To turn away. To shut that part of our heart, or that part of our life, or that experience from our life, to close the door on that so that not even God has access to it. So that sometimes not even we have access to it. So that no one has access to it. But those same places can also lead to a deeper experience of God's love in our life. Emotions. Jesus, in His life, experienced the same emotions that we do. He felt things very deeply. Right? One day He walks into the temple, and in the temple He finds that the places where the only places in the temple where the Gentiles could come and worship had been flooded with people who were exploiting the space for personal gain. And in the story, as Jesus walks in, He's offended that people don't have access to worship. And He stops and He makes a whip, And he goes through the temple and he drives the animals that were there for the sacrifices, drives them out of the temple. He goes and turns the tables over the money changers. He's responding in anger, in righteous anger, because he's feeling this indignation deeply. He goes to his friend's Lazarus' tomb and he stands there and he's standing in the face of death and he snorts in anger and in disdain for death itself. He prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, anticipating what is about to come in his life. And he sweats blood and anguish. He feels deeply. He cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus himself on the cross. You ever feel alone? Jesus felt alone, forgotten. And Scripture makes it very clear that in these feelings that he had, that are the same as the feelings that we had, he wasn't faking it. He wasn't just like pretending to have these feelings. He actually was. Hebrews says, since the children, that's us, have flesh and blood, we do, he too shared in their humanity, our humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. He goes on in verse 17, chapter 2, "For this reason he had to be made like us, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest representing us before God in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help us, those who are being tempted." Jesus felt the same things that we felt. He felt them deeply. But he was never controlled by his emotions. He had emotional responses. He had trigger things that, but they didn't take over his life. He didn't shut them down. He didn't close them off. And they didn't dictate what happened next. They didn't control him. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, he was tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. And here's the important part for us today. Is he believed that it was possible for us too to have emotions, to feel things deeply, to have that quarter-second trigger and that quarter-second chemical release into our bodies, to have all of those experiences as he did, and to not be controlled by them in the same way that he was not. Stop and think about that for a second, right? Think about the last time that something happened and you lost your head and responded in a way that left a trail of destruction. And that not having to happen, that not having to be that way. He says in John chapter 14 to his disciples, this is right before he's going to the cross. Right before his arrest, right before everything that's going to happen. And these guys were his best friends, and they had put their hopes and their lives and their dreams in him. They had left their jobs, they had left their families to follow him. They had been all in on Jesus, and he's getting ready to go to the cross, and he says these words to them: "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Was he taunting them, or was he teasing them, or did he really believe that there was a way for them to not get taken out by the moment that was upon them? Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. He's saying to them, something's going to happen here, and you have a choice about how you respond. He's saying to them and to us that we have an active role in shepherding our emotional life. that we have a part to play in caring for our souls, for our hearts, for our spirits, in ways that lead to life and love and hope and healing. In the first week of our series, Inside Out, right? That's what we've been talking about. That the transformation that God purposes to do in our lives is not an outside-in work. It's something happening inside of us. It's the good in us that's then bringing good fruit out of us. How does that happen? How do we do that? In the first week, we talked about the temple. First of all, it was the tabernacle when Moses brought the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. God gave them directions on building this tabernacle. It was a tent of meeting. And it was a sign of God's presence with the people of Israel as they're walking through the wilderness. And they could go to the tabernacle and meet with God there. And then later on, after Israel had established itself in the promised land, they built a temple. And the temple was now, God didn't live in the temple, but it was the place that they went to meet with God. And God filled the tabernacle, and God filled the temple with his glory, with his presence among them. And then that Jesus, in his ministry, in the same way that they would sacrifice these animals to cover their sins so they could come and worship with God, Jesus comes and ultimately says, animals can't actually atone, can't cover, can't make up for sin. I'm going to make a sacrifice. That sacrifice will be once and for all. And after that sacrifice, and through that sacrifice, and through the forgiveness that comes with that, and the cleansing that comes with that, Jesus is saying, and then I'm going to move into your heart. And Paul says now, he says it definitively, that we are now the temple of the living God. That through Christ, he lives and dwells in us. And that is Paul's prayer for the church at Ephesus and for us. I pray that out of his glorious riches, his glorious filling, that he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. That we can feel deeply and not lose control. That we can walk through all the struggles and challenges and the frustrations and the disappointments and the heartaches and the sorrows of life and not lose control through a union with God, through oneness with God. John 17, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me. Oneness with God. Dallas Willard was professor of philosophy at USC. Authored several best-selling books. Probably will go down in history as the best Christian thinker of our generation. Just incredible mind. And devoted a lot of his life. USC is a secular university, and this guy, he was brilliant, and a brilliant Christian thinker, follower of Jesus. Spent a lot of his life and his study and a lot of his writing was directed at helping people make this intimate connecting with God, an experiential relationship, not just knowing about God, but knowing God personally, knowing God experientially. And believing that out of this union, that we would experience transformation inside out. He defines spiritual maturity this way. He said, you know you're spiritually mature when your impulse response to your enemy, your spontaneous reaction is love. That's when you've arrived at spiritual maturity, when your impulse response to your enemy is love. I just get it, right? When your impulse response to the name Donald Trump or Joe Biden, whichever side of the political, when your impulse response is not, ugh, when your impulse response is love, you have arrived at spiritual maturity. When your impulse response to that guy who goes to work at 5 o'clock every morning and revs his motorcycle when he's driving past your house is love. At the end of his life, Dallas Willard started comparing his notes between his lifelong pursuit of understanding this transformation of this oneness with God. He started comparing his notes with what we've learned over the last several years. He died in 2013, so this goes back a few years, but we're starting to learn so much about neuroscience and about what happens in the brain and how the brain functions and he works. And so he's looking at what we're learning in neuroscience, and he's looking at his lifelong research into this encountering in a relationship with God in an experiential way. And what neuroscience was revealing was that the brain functions that determine our character are most profoundly shaped by who we love. Now that they put people on brain monitors, on brain scanners, and they're watching them and they're giving them specific impulses and seeing how their brain responds to those impulses. And they've been doing this, it's just crazy, crazy stuff about how the brain works. And what they're seeing and what they've observed is that the thing that changes character in our lives comes from transformation that results from attachment love. Now, in a sense, this probably isn't rocket science, right? I mean, how many of us have had our lives changed by a person? Like we were here, we were going this direction, and it was a train wreck, and we met somebody, and that relationship took us in a different direction. I mean, we see that all the time in movies, right? Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino is just a nasty, grumpy old man, and he's ready to kill everybody in his neighborhood, and he forms this relationship with this kid who lives next door, and his life has changed. He's still a nasty, grumpy old man, but now he's like giving up his life for his neighbor. Something's changed through this relationship. Attachment love. In fact, that the only kind of love that helps the brain learn better character is attachment love. Or said another way, changing character as far as the brain is concerned means attaching in new and better ways. Changing character as far as the brain is concerned means attaching in new and better ways. When we think about growing in faith, we think about becoming more spiritually mature. Oftentimes, our thoughts go to what we believe and how we behave. We're going to know the Bible, believe the right things, and behave the right way. But what we find in Jesus talking about this oneness with God and what modern brain science is showing us is that character is shaped more by who we love than by what we believe. We want to know, how can I become a better person? What we're learning is that the question is not, how do I become a better person? How do I bear better fruit? How can I enter into a deeper union with God? A deeper oneness with God requires the renewing of the mind. That's last week. Requires a restored heart. Loving God with our whole heart means opening up those places inside of us that we have shut off because of the ways that they make us feel and the feelings that we don't want to have, and those parts of our hearts and our lives that we shut down. So last week we talked about consecrating your mental life to God. This week, consecrating your emotional life to God. So here's your assignment, all right? It's all towards this aim of oneness with God, consecrating your emotional life to God. First of all, just like we talked about last, consecrating your emotional life to God is bringing it under His protection and for His provision. Saying, God, all this stuff, all this jumbled up stuff inside of me that I've been kind of pushing back for years or anesthetizing or trying to, I'm opening the door to you and I'm asking you to protect me and to provide me what I need for the work that you want to do in my heart and my life. Bring it under His provision and protection. Acknowledging our wounds, naming our losses, allowing our hearts to grieve them, inviting God into the conversation. Because our tendency is when we're ashamed of something or afraid of, we want to push it away instead of saying, no, God, right here where I am ashamed, and the last place I want anyone in, I'm inviting you here. Meet me in this place. I'm opening this part of my heart up to you. And know that Scripture models bold emotional honesty. And you don't have to pull punches with God. Read the Psalms, and it's like flat out anger, frustration, disappointment, disillusionment. God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, why this? God, why now? Complete honesty. God can do anything with what we allow Him into, but nothing with what we shut Him out of. Invite Him in. Ground yourself in the love of Christ. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God, that you may be grounded and established in the love of Christ. I gave you an exercise a couple weeks ago, loving God. Loving God for who He is, for what He's done. What are the things you love? And just, God, I love you for this. God, I love you. I love you. Saying it out loud, declaring your love, establishing, remembering all the things that we have to love God for, embracing, wallowing, dwelling, living in that, establishing His love. Subjecting your emotions to the truth of Christ. That in our emotional consecration, there is also a mental truth part of it that we talked about last week. That we have to come back to, okay, here's what I'm feeling. What is the truth? To bring every thought, make it captive, make it obedient to Christ. As our hearts are healed through union with Christ, our emotions will reflect that healing. As our hearts are healed through our union with Christ, our emotions will reflect that healing, restoring our soul, transforming our character, and empowering us to love as an impulse response to our enemies. So here's the kick, right? I started with my dog. Everybody says you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The old tricks never worked. Unless you're at that point now where you can say, my impulse response to the name of my least favorite politician is love, right? The trick hasn't worked. And Jesus says, right, that he started a good work in us and he's going to bring that work to completion, which is to say, until this dog is dead, he purposes to continue to teach you, not tricks, to offer you oneness that leads to transformation. If you're lost and swimming in your minds right now, okay, cool. We got one more week to this series. We're going to wrap it all up next week. I'm going to tie all the pieces together. And what we're going to be looking at as we wrap it is every week I've talked about some unique individual things that we can do. How do we put the pieces together in our daily lives to nurture this oneness, this union, God in us, that Jesus talked about? That the goodness that he is moving in us and accomplishing in us becomes this internal source of life that spills out of us in our work, in our marriages, in our families, in our parenting, with our neighbors, in our politics, in our religion, in our whole lives. That even though outwardly we are wasting away, inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Lord, I pray that you would continue to give us right thoughts, thoughts that are in line with the truth that is revealed in Scripture and through your life and by your Spirit, and thoughts that lead us to right beliefs. And encourage in us the conviction, the understanding, the belief that you can change us, but we can't change ourselves. That you purpose to transform us. But it is an inside job. And that you've made way for us to have a connection with you to accomplish that. Understand that it is a process, a lifelong process. But it's never too late. I pray in Jesus' name.